January 17, 1945, Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. The frost clings to the barbed wire like silk spun from winter itself. Dawn has not yet broken, but the air is already alive with sound boots crushing gravel, the metallic snap of rifle bolts, voices barking orders that cut through the cold like blades. Inside the officers' mess hall, steam rises from coffee cups held by men too tired to taste what they drink. Outside, beyond the rows of wooden barracks painted the color of dried blood, a different kind of prisoner stirs. Not men behind wire, but women. German women. Captured auxiliaries, administrative staff. Communications operators, Nachrichtenfeldfern, who once typed orders that sent panzers rolling across Poland. Who logged radio frequencies that guided Stukas over London. They wear the same gray wool they wore in service, now marked with white circles on back and sleeve. Prisoners of war. But they do not feel defeated. Not yet. One of them, Marguerite Hoffmann, aged 23, formerly of the Wehrmacht Signals Corps, stands at the window of the detention barracks and watches the American soldiers assemble in the pre-dawn darkness. She smirks. The other women gather behind her, 17 in total, all young, all certain of something the Americans do not yet understand. "Look at them," Marguerite says in German, her breath fogging the glass. "They march like clerks. They hold their rifles like brooms." The others laugh softly, a sound like wind through dead leaves. They have been told stories since childhood. Stories of German superiority, of discipline bred into bone, of soldiers forged in the crucible of the Prussian tradition. And now, watching these Americans stumble through morning formation, they believe what they have always been told. Our men are better. They do not know what is coming. They do not know that within 72 hours, their smirks will vanish. That the certainty hammered into them by 12 years of propaganda will crack like ice beneath a boot. That they will witness something their ideology never prepared them to see, a demonstration of what free men, trained not by fear but by purpose, are capable of becoming. To understand what happened at Fort Leonard Wood in those frozen January days, one must first understand what these women believed. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but they had served the Reich with the same fervor as any man in field gray. The Nachrichtenfeldfern female communications auxiliaries numbered over 500,000 by 1944, operating switchboards, decoding messages, coordinating logistics across a continent at war. They had been educated in schools where textbooks proclaimed Germanic racial destiny, where maps showed a greater Reich stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals, where newsreels depicted German soldiers as Bermenschen, supermen sculpted by discipline and will. Marguerite Hoffmann herself had grown up in Heidelberg, daughter of a minor party official. She remembered the torchlight parades of her childhood, the pageantry of strength, the conviction that Germany was not merely a nation, but an idea made flesh, an idea of order imposed upon chaos, of hierarchy upon equality, of excellence upon mediocrity. When she joined the Signals Corps in 1942, she believed she was serving something eternal. When Allied bombs began falling on German cities, she believed it was temporary, a test that true Germanic spirit would overcome. When the Reich collapsed and she found herself in American custody, transported across an ocean to a Missouri winter, she believed still that the defeat was circumstantial, not fundamental. German soldiers, she told herself and the others, were simply better. Better trained. Better disciplined. Better men. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to confirm every stereotype whispered in Wehrmacht barracks and printed in Das Schwarze Korps. They were soft. They came from a mongrel nation of immigrants and individualists, a country with no martial tradition, no warrior culture, no breeding program to produce soldiers. They chewed gum. They listened to jazz. They wrote letters to their mothers and carried photographs of sweethearts. How could such men, boys, really stand against soldiers raised in the tradition of Frederick the Great, of Clausewitz, of the Iron Cross? This is what Marguerite and the others believed as they watched the Americans through the barracks window that January morning. They expected to see a training exercise that would confirm their prejudices, sloppy formations, lazy drill. The kind of half-hearted military theater performed by men who did not truly understand war. What they saw instead would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The first day began ordinarily enough. The German women were permitted, under guard, to observe the training grounds from a designated area behind a low fence. It was not generosity that allowed this, but policy. The camp commander, Colonel Edward Hartwell, believed that prisoners should see American military capacity firsthand. "Let them watch," he told his staff. "Let them see what free men can do." At 06:00 hours, the trainees assembled 240 men of the 87th Infantry Division, undergoing final combat conditioning before deployment to the European theater. They ranged in age from 18 to 34. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from Massachusetts, stockbrokers and truck drivers and schoolteachers, united by nothing except the accident of birth and the necessity of war. They wore olive-drab fatigues stained with yesterday's mud. Their faces were young, unlined, ordinary. Marguerite lit a cigarette and leaned against the fence. "This should be amusing," she said. The training began with a 12-mile march. Full pack, full gear, 60 pounds of equipment per man. The temperature hovered at 19 degrees Fahrenheit. The route wound through wooded hills thick with ice and frozen underbrush. No roads, no respite. The drill instructor, a master sergeant named Dolan, who had fought in North Africa, set the pace at 4 miles per hour. Not a stroll. Not a jog. A relentless, grinding stride that devoured distance and tested will. The German women watched the column depart, boots churning mud and slush. Within the first mile, several men fell. They got up. They fell again. They got up again. No one was carried. No one was left behind. The sergeants did not coddle. They shouted, profane and relentless, but they did not strike, did not humiliate, did not break. The men kept moving. "They will quit," one of the German women said. Her name was Helga, formerly of the Luftwaffe administrative staff. "This is theater. In 2 hours they will rest." 2 hours passed. The column did not rest. They crested a hill, descended into a ravine where icy water ran shin-deep, forded it without hesitation, climbed the far slope. The cold was a living thing now, clawing at exposed skin, turning breath into white clouds that vanished almost before they formed. Men slipped. Men stumbled. No one stopped. 3 hours. 4. The German women stopped laughing. They stood silent now, breath steaming, watching shapes move through distant trees like figures in a dream. At the 5-hour mark, the column returned. The men were filthy, soaked, shaking with cold. Their faces were blank with exhaustion. But every man who had started the march finished it. Not one had quit. Marguerite crushed her cigarette beneath her boot. She said nothing. That afternoon, the training shifted. The German women were moved to bleachers overlooking an obstacle course, a nightmare landscape of barbed wire, muddy trenches, wooden walls, rope nets, and live machine gun fire. Sergeant Dolan stood before the assembled soldiers and explained the exercise with the kind of brutal simplicity that soldiers understand. "This course replicates combat conditions," he said. "You will crawl through mud while bullets pass 18 inches above your head. You will climb. You will jump. You will do it in under 8 minutes, or you will do it again. And again. Until you get it right or you die trying." No preliminaries. No warm-up. The first group of 10 men moved to the starting line. A whistle blew. They dropped into the mud and began to crawl. The machine guns opened fire immediately. Browning .30 calibers. Loaded with live ammunition, mounted on fixed tripods with overhead stops to prevent depression below a certain angle. The tracers drew burning lines through the winter air, so close to the crawling men that mud kicked up around them, so close that the crack of supersonic bullets was constant. A whip-crack symphony of death held barely at bay. The men did not hesitate. They crawled forward, elbows and knees churning mud, rifles cradled against their chests, eyes focused ahead. When they reached the wire, they rolled beneath it, barbed points tearing at uniforms, scraping skin, and emerged filthy and bleeding but moving. Up and over the walls, hand over hand on the ropes, through water-filled trenches that reeked of diesel and decay, under more wire. Always forward, always moving, the German women watched in silence. This was not theater. This was not parade ground drill. This was something else entirely, a kind of controlled violence, a deliberate exposure to death that skirted the edge of madness. In the Wehrmacht, such training existed only for elite units, Fallschirmjäger paratroopers, Waffen-SS assault battalions. But these Americans were regular infantry, line soldiers, the men who would form the bulk of the invasion force. And they were being trained as if every single one of them was expected to close with the enemy and win. One man, a private named Collins from Ohio, took a fall from the rope net. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from his lungs, and lay still for a moment. The German women leaned forward, expecting him to be carried off. Instead, Collins stood. Blood ran from his nose. He spat red into the mud, climbed the net again, and finished the course. "They do not give up," Helga whispered. It was not a question. It was a realization, spoken with something close to fear. By the end of the day, every man had completed the obstacle course. Some had run it 3 times. Some 4, none had quit. As the sun set and the temperature dropped into the single digits, the soldiers assembled for inspection. They stood at attention, uniforms ruined, faces blank with exhaustion, bodies trembling with cold and spent adrenaline. Sergeant Dolan walked the ranks, his breath steaming, his eyes cold and appraising. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, dismissed. The men broke formation and walked slowly, stiffly toward the barracks. No one spoke. No one complained. They simply moved, one foot in front of the other, toward warmth and rest. Marguerite watched them go. For the first time since her capture, doubt whispered in her mind. Not loud, not yet, but present. A small crack in the edifice of certainty. The second day began before dawn. The German women were roused from their barracks at 0500 hours and told to dress warmly. "You will observe live fire exercises," the guard said. His English was accented, his manner professional but distant. They were escorted to a ridgeline overlooking a valley that had been converted into a mock battlefield. Bunkers, trenches, wire obstacles, wooden structures representing buildings. Smoke generators created an artificial fog that clung to the ground like something alive. What followed was not training. It was orchestrated chaos. At 0600 hours, the American artillery opened fire. Not blanks. Not simulators. Live shells, 105mm howitzers firing from positions 2 miles distant, their thunder rolling across the valley like the voice of an angry god. The shells impacted in the mock battlefield, geysers of earth and smoke erupting, the concussion waves visible in the cold air. For 10 minutes the barrage continued, methodical and devastating, and then it ceased as abruptly as it had begun. Silence, smoke drifting. Then movement. The infantry advanced. Not in parade formation, but in combat spread, small groups of men moving from cover to cover. One team providing suppressing fire while another bounded forward, then reversing the pattern. They moved through the smoke and the torn earth with a kind of terrible efficiency, their rifles firing blanks now, but the discipline real, the coordination practiced, the aggression palpable. When they reached the wire, Engineers dashed forward with Bangalore torpedoes' long metal tubes, packed with explosives, shoved them beneath the obstacles and detonated them. The blast tearing gaps through which the infantry poured. Machine guns chattered. Mortar coughed and sent shells arcing into the mock enemy positions. The Americans flowed forward like water, finding gaps, exploiting weakness, overwhelming resistance. And then the armor arrived. Tanks M4 Shermans, 30 tons of rolling steel, crested the ridge and descended into the valley. Their 75mm guns firing, their machine guns sweeping the flanks, their engines roaring like beasts. They moved in coordination with the infantry, providing covering fire, crushing wire beneath their treads, turning the mock battlefield into a vision of industrialized slaughter. The entire assault took 17 minutes. When it ended, the valley was silent except for the idling of tank engines and the clink of spent cartridges settling into mud. The German women stood frozen on the ridgeline. They had watched Wehrmacht assaults and newsreels, panzer columns rolling through Poland, Stuka screaming over France. They had believed those images represented the pinnacle of military power. But this was something different. This was not the choreographed brutality of blitzkrieg. This was the application of overwhelming material force combined with tactical discipline, a demonstration of what happens when a wealthy industrial nation decides to make war. The Americans had not merely trained their soldiers. They had equipped them with an abundance of firepower that rendered individual courage almost secondary. They had mechanized warfare to a degree the Wehrmacht, for all its vaunted skill, could no longer match. "They fight like machines," one of the women said. Her voice was small, almost lost in the wind. "No," Marguerite said quietly. "They fight like men who have machines. It is not the same." That afternoon, the German women were brought to the firing range. They watched American soldiers engage targets at distances ranging from 100 to 500 yards. Firing the M1 Garand rifle, a semi-automatic weapon that could fire 8 rounds as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. The German women were intimately familiar with the standard Wehrmacht rifle, the Karabiner 98,000, a bolt-action weapon, reliable and accurate but slow, requiring the soldier to manually cycle the bolt between each shot. They had been told this was sufficient. That German marksmanship, superior training, and fighting spirit compensated for any technological difference. But watching the Americans fire, watching them pour rounds downrange with a speed and volume that seemed almost obscene, Marguerite understood the lie. In a firefight, volume of fire matters. The ability to suppress the enemy, to keep their heads down while your comrades maneuver, to deliver overwhelming firepower at the decisive moment, these things win battles. And the Americans had it. Not just in their rifles, but in their machine guns, their mortar, their artillery, their tanks. Abundance, industrial abundance. The kind of material superiority that no amount of discipline could overcome. That night, lying in her bunk, Marguerite stared at the ceiling and thought about the German soldiers she had known. Men who had fought in Russia, who had endured winters colder than this Missouri freeze, who had stood their ground against Soviet artillery barrages that turned the earth into liquid fire. Brave men. Skilled men. But poorly supplied men. Men who had fought on half rations while American soldiers ate 3 hot meals a day. Men who had scrounged for ammunition while American units fired thousands of rounds in a single training exercise. Men who had been told that spirit and will could overcome material disadvantage, and who had died believing it. The crack in her certainty widened. The third day was the cruelest. The German women were taken to watch hand-to-hand combat training, bayonet drill, and close-quarters fighting. They expected brutality. What they saw was controlled savagery. The instructor was a Marine Corps veteran named Gunny Sergeant Price, a man who had fought the Japanese on Guadalcanal and learned lessons written in blood. He stood before a group of soldiers and explained, in blunt terms, the reality of close combat. The enemy will try to kill you, he said. Not defeat you. Not capture you. Kill you. You will respond in kind. Hesitation is death. Mercy is death. You will fight with every weapon you possess: rifle, bayonet, entrenching tool, helmet, fists, teeth. You will fight until the enemy is no longer a threat. Do you understand? The soldiers answered in unison, "Yes, Gunny Sergeant." What followed was a demonstration of the science of killing. The Americans practiced bayonet thrusts on dummies, not half-hearted jabs, but full-throated lunges. Bodies twisting, muscles coiling and releasing. The blade punching through canvas and straw with sickening ease. They practiced rifle butt strikes to the head, the throat, the groin. They practiced gouging eyes, breaking fingers, using the edge of a helmet as a weapon. They practiced until the movements became automatic, until the human body became a weapon system as refined and deadly as any firearm. And then they practiced against each other. Padded weapons, protective gear, but full-speed combat. Men grappled in the mud, snarling and straining, throwing each other to the ground, simulating kills with a matter-of-fact efficiency that was more disturbing than rage would have been. This was not blood fury. This was trained violence, deliberate, repeatable, industrialized. One of the German women, a girl named Liesel who could not have been older than 19, began to cry. "They are animals," she whispered. Marguerite turned to her. "No," she said. "They are what we made them." Because that was the truth neither the propaganda nor the ideology had prepared them for. The Americans had not wanted this war. They had not glorified it, not built their national identity around martial valor, not raised their children to believe that war was the highest expression of human will. But when war came to them, when it was forced upon them by distant empires drunk on conquest, they had responded not with fanaticism but with something more dangerous: industrial efficiency and democratic resolve. They had taken their farmers and factory workers, their clerks and college boys, and transformed them into soldiers capable of meeting the Wehrmacht and the Imperial Japanese Army on equal terms. Not through ideology, not through propaganda, but through training, through material abundance, through the simple recognition that free men, properly equipped and led, are the equal of any warrior caste. The German women had been raised to believe in the superiority of the Germanic soldier, a superiority rooted in breeding, in culture, in some ineffable racial quality that made German men inherently better fighters. But watching these Americans, Marguerite understood the hollowness of that belief. The Wehrmacht had been a formidable fighting force, not because Germans were genetically superior, but because they had been well trained and well led. And now the Americans had matched that training, exceeded it in some ways, and coupled it with an industrial base that could produce tanks and planes and ammunition in quantities Germany could never hope to match. It was not a question of better men. It was a question of better systems. And the Americans had built the better system. On the fourth day, the German women were brought to the quartermaster's depot. It was not part of the planned observation, but Colonel Hartwell had decided they needed to see something beyond the training. They needed to see the source. The depot was a vast warehouse complex, rows of buildings stretching across acres of Missouri farmland. Inside, stacked floor to ceiling, were supplies. Not luxuries, not treasures, just supplies. Crates of ammunition, millions of rounds, more than the German women had seen in their entire service combined. Barrels of fuel. Pallets of rations, C-rations and C-rations, each containing meat, crackers, chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, uniforms, boots, medical supplies. Spare parts for vehicles, tires, engine blocks, radios, everything an army needed, in quantities that seemed impossible. A young lieutenant, barely older than Marguerite, served as their guide. He walked them through the depot with an almost casual air, as if this abundance were normal. We produce enough material to supply 12 million men under arms, he explained. Our factories operate 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Our agricultural output feeds not only our own soldiers, but allied forces as well. Our shipyards launch a new cargo vessel every 8 hours. Our aircraft factories produce 1 bomber every 63 minutes. Marguerite stopped walking. She stared at the endless rows of supplies and felt something break inside her. Not her will, not her courage, but her certainty. Because in that moment, she understood the arithmetic of the war. Germany had mobilized its entire economy, stripped its civilian sector to the bone, and still could not match this. The Reich had promised victory through superior will, superior soldiers, superior racial destiny. But will did not fill an empty fuel tank. Destiny did not replace a destroyed aircraft. And superior soldiers, no matter how brave, could not fight without bullets. How? She asked in halting English. How do you have so much? The lieutenant looked at her with something like pity. Because we are not a dictatorship, he said. Because our factories are not bombed. Because our workers are not slaves. Because a free people, producing freely, will always outproduce a slave economy. Always. It was the simplest explanation and the most devastating. The German women had been told that democracy was weakness, that freedom bred softness, that only authoritarian discipline could unlock a nation's true potential. But standing in that depot, surrounded by the material proof of American abundance, Marguerite understood the lie. Authoritarian systems are brittle. They rely on fear, on coercion, on the suppression of individual initiative. And while such systems can produce short-term results, they cannot sustain prolonged conflict against a society where people work not because they are forced to, but because they choose to, because they believe in something beyond the barrel of a gun. That night, Marguerite sat with the other women in their barracks. They did not speak of what they had seen. They did not need to. The silence was confession enough. They had come to Fort Leonard Wood believing that German soldiers were superior, that the Reich's defeat was a fluke, a product of overwhelming numbers rather than any inherent weakness. But in 4 days, that belief had been systematically dismantled. They had watched American soldiers endure hardships equal to anything the Wehrmacht inflicted on its own men. They had watched them train with a competence and ferocity that matched the best German units. They had seen the material abundance that underpinned American military power, an abundance so vast it rendered individual valor almost secondary, and they had understood, finally, that the war had been lost not on the battlefield but in the factory. The farm, the free market, lost the moment the Reich decided to pit its ideology against American productivity. The epilogue came quietly, as such things often do. On the 5th day, the German women were assembled for repatriation processing. They would be sent to a different camp, eventually to be returned to a Germany that no longer existed, to a nation divided and occupied, to cities reduced to rubble and ideologies reduced to ash. As they stood in line, waiting for transport, Marguerite saw the soldiers again, the same men she had watched train, now loading onto trucks bound for the East Coast, for transport ships for the final battles in Europe. One of them, a private whose name she never learned, caught her eye. He was young, perhaps 20, with the kind of ordinary face that would vanish in a crowd. He looked at her for a moment, and she saw in his eyes not hatred, not triumph, but something sadder, exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who knows what is coming and will do it anyway. Not because he wants to, not because he believes in conquest or glory or racial destiny, but because he must. Because his country asked him, and he said yes. He nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement, and then climbed into the truck. The convoy pulled away, engines rumbling, leaving only dust and the fading sound of gears shifting. Marguerite watched until they disappeared. Then she turned to Helga, the only one of the women she considered a friend, and said in German, "We were wrong." Helga did not ask what she meant. She knew. "We were told our men were better," Marguerite continued. "That German discipline, German training, German blood made us superior." But it was a lie. Not because German soldiers were not brave or skilled, they were. But because bravery without supply is suicide. Skill without support is wasted. And blood without bread is just blood. She paused, watching the dust settle on the empty road. They did not beat us because they were better men. They beat us because they were free men. And free men, when threatened, will build and produce and fight with a determination no slave system can match. That is the lesson. That is the truth we were never taught. The other women said nothing. What could they say? They had seen it. The abundance. The discipline. The efficiency. The terrible, relentless competence of a democracy at war. They had taunted American soldiers, called them soft, believed them inferior. And they had been proven wrong in the most absolute way possible, not by argument, but by demonstration. Not by ideology, but by evidence. The Reich had promised them a 1,000-year empire built on the superiority of the Germanic race. It had lasted 12 years and ended in ashes. The Americans had promised nothing except the right to live free. And from that simple promise had forged a military machine, capable of grinding empires into dust as Marguerite boarded the transport that would carry her away from Fort Leonard Wood. She looked back one last time at the training grounds, the barracks, the obstacle course where American soldiers had crawled through mud under live fire. She thought of the young private who had nodded to her, of the thousands like him boarding ships to cross an ocean and finish a war. She thought of the food, the ammunition, the endless supplies that would keep those men fighting until victory was complete. And she understood. Finally, what her ideology had hidden from her, that freedom is not weakness, that democracy is not softness, that a people who choose to fight are infinitely more dangerous than a people who are forced to. The truck pulled away. Marguerite closed her eyes and let the truth wash over her, cold and undeniable as the Missouri winter. The Reich had told her that German men were better. But the Reich had been wrong about many things. And in the end, all its lies had not been enough to stop the free men who came from across the sea, who trained in the cold, who fought not for glory but for home, and who won not because they were supermen, but because they were simply and terribly enough.